This week in wrestling history, we begin 30 years ago. Today is Survivor Series. It's all about 30 years ago today on November 22nd, 1990. Home Alone was the #1 movie in America, and WWE presented its 4th annual Survivor Series pay-per-view, which did 400,000 buys and would hold the record for the highest Survivor Series buy rate until the Deadly Game Show in 1998. This show is remembered for two things. Well, three. Three things for me. It's the only time they ever featured a grand finale match of survival at the end with all of the survivors from earlier in the night. But it also featured the televised debut of The Undertaker as Ted DiBiase's mystery partner, managed by Brother Love. Bruce Pritchard was already stretched thin with his workload. He did not want to go full-time with the gig, which is why they ended up bringing in Paul Bearer to manage The Undertaker. Road Warrior Hawk, by the way, came up with the name Paul Bearer, and he came up with the name Paul Bearer while he was sitting on the toilet dropping a deuce. Undertaker was the replacement in this match. That's a true story, by the way. Undertaker was on this team as a replacement for Bad News Brown. I don't know if they ever announced Bad News Brown on TV as being part of this team, but he was definitely supposed to be. There was even a photo shoot. WWE.com has put the photo up many times before. They put up these photo galleries, and there is a photo from a shoot that he did with Ted DiBiase, Honky Tonk Man, and Greg Valentine, and Bad News has a wad of cash from DiBiase in his hand. But what happened is he had a falling out with Vince McMahon after SummerSlam when he got his payout for WrestleMania. Because back then, and I don't know if it works this way even now to this day, but certainly back then, if you had a show like a WrestleMania, you likely would not know what you made on that show or get your payoff for the show until around SummerSlam. I mean, it could be that long. It would come months later once everything was all tallied up and everything. So he found out around SummerSlam time what he made for WrestleMania and the match with Roddy Piper. That was the one where Piper came out dressed out half black. He found out that Piper got $50,000 for their match of WrestleMania 6. He claims that he only got $10,000. And 2,000 Canadian dollars. And so he was basically finished at that point. He finished out some of his dates, and after that he was gone. DiBiase, though, I think DiBiase was better off without him, because Bad News Brown walked out on his partners each of the previous 2 years at Survivor Series, and he likely would have done the same here. Ultimate Warrior led a team of the Texas Tornado and LOD, and every single member of that team is now dead. In fact, they opposed Mr. Perfect and all 3 members of Demolition. And half of that team is gone as well. And the announcers as well. Gorilla Monsoon and Roddy Piper, they're also gone. Everybody is gone. Everybody is like the Sixth Sense here. I see dead people. It's awful. Axe and Smash are literally the sole survivors from that match. The original members of Demolition, Crush was on the team as well, he's gone. Axe and Smash are the sole survivors left from that team. And they're still not in the WWE Hall of Fame. So sadly, that will probably end up being another one of those, boy, it sure would have been nice to get them in for a speech before it was too late kind of deals. I hope not, but it doesn't look good. This was Axe's final WWE match. Texas Tornado was introduced as the Intercontinental Champion when he came out for this match, even though he actually lost the belt back to Mr. Perfect 3 days earlier at the Superstars taping, but because it wasn't airing on TV until the following month, got to keep kayfabe, he is still the Intercontinental Champion on TV as far as anybody knows, and so that's why they announced him, and he still, not only was he carrying the belt on this show, he was still defending the belt at house shows, even after he technically lost it. Bret Hart was part of that same Survivor Series match with The Undertaker. In fact, the two of them started the match together. And he was in that match despite the fact that Bret's brother Dean passed away the day before the show. He tells the story in his book. He had brought Bruce to the show. He's trying to get Bruce a job with WWE. And then their brother died, and he gets to the show, and he sees Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson, who obviously have not heard about what happened. And I think, if I remember, I think Patterson made a comment to Bret like, hey, cheer up, you look like somebody died or something. And Bret said, well, actually, my brother Dean passed away. And he said they just kept walking. They were kind of yucking it up and laughing about something, and they just kept walking. So who knows what that was about? Maybe they thought he was joking. Maybe they didn't hear him, but I'm sure that was a pretty shitty moment for him. So he was wrestling with a heavy heart. Not only was he wrestling the day after his brother died, but he was wrestling a guy called the Undertaker. That's got to be a little eerie. But the other thing this show is memorable for, outside of the debut of Vince McMahon's greatest gimmick, is the debut of maybe his worst. The Gobbledygooker, who hatched out of a giant egg that they teased on television for weeks. Is it a wrestler? Is it the Playmate of the Month? Who is it? Who or what is going to pop out of this egg at the Survivor Series? And when the egg finally hatched, and this giant deformed chicken popped out, or turkey, the fans in the building booed. Not the reaction that Vince McMahon was hoping for. He had wanted to make this guy a mascot, similar to the San Diego chicken, that would, I guess, entertain the fans and take pictures with the kids and shoot t-shirts out of a t-shirt gun and at the house shows. That was the idea. That was the actual original idea for the Gobbledygooker. And he didn't last very long. Hector Guerrero was the one inside the costume. Hector Guerrero of the famed Guerrero wrestling family, who at that time was a gym teacher. And the idea was that, look, he's a gym teacher and he's athletic. He can pull off all of this cool-looking gymnastic stuff in the costume. But nobody bothered to think, hey, can he do all of that cool stuff while he is wearing this giant deformed turkey costume? The answer is no. They had not thought about that. And so the only thing he was really able to do that was kind of impressive were a bunch of forward rolls. He really couldn't do anything else. He could barely see out of that costume. And they kept him in that damn egg for hours. They only put a few small fans inside the egg to keep him cool. He had to be in there for hours. Imagine being trapped in that egg for 6 hours in that costume. It's a miracle he was even conscious when he got that cue and they didn't have to send a team in to break the egg open and they find his dead turkey body inside. Boy, that would have gone over real well with all the kids. Mommy, why is he not moving? Why is that turkey not breathing? Ah, shit. Somebody forgot to poke holes in the egg. Thankfully, that didn't happen. 25 years ago this week, on November 19, 1995, the first Survivor Series not to be held on either Thanksgiving Day or Thanksgiving Eve. I do miss when it was the Thanksgiving Eve tradition. In fact, one of the plans I have this year, it's just me and my brother doing Thanksgiving. We're going to play a whole bunch of the old Survivor Series shows while he's cooking, and then later on, his job is to cook, I'm going to eat. That's the plan. We're going to play a whole bunch of old Survivor Series shows. Just to get back in that feeling. When it used to be the Thanksgiving Day. At the very beginning, it was the Thanksgiving Day tradition. Only later did it become the Thanksgiving Eve tradition. But Mr. Perfect made his WWE return as an announcer on this show, still collecting those Lloyds of London insurance payments, so he wasn't getting back in the ring so quickly. Alundra Blaze made her second to last appearance on WWE television, losing on the losing end of a Survivor Series match against Bertha Faye and a group of Japanese women stars. She made one Raw appearance the following week and then was fired a few weeks later when Vince McMahon decided to just abandon the women's division altogether, which led to Medusa showing up on WCW Monday Nitro not long after that with the WWF Women's title that they never bothered to get back from her, and she proceeded to drop it into the trash can. That was an Eric Bischoff idea. She did not want to do it. Of course, she's the one who got all the heat for it, but it was an Eric Bischoff idea. We had the first ever wildcard match featuring heels tagging with the babyfaces and babyfaces tagging with the heels, and Bret the Hitman Hart regained the WWE Championship from Diesel, ending Diesel's year-long reign as champion. Diesel powerbombed Bret twice. After the match was over, he became the first guy really to usher in the era of the cool heel in WWE. He was really like more of a tweener. You know, he stayed friends on TV, on camera, with Shawn Michaels, who was the big babyface. And he would only slap hands with fans in the audience who were wearing the black Diesel glove, which was smart, right? Got to get people to buy your merch. So he would only smack hands and high-five you if you had his glove on. This was also the very first time that the Spanish announce table was destroyed on a WWE pay-per-view. Now, the very next night on Raw, they did a serious angle involving Shawn Michaels. He was in a match with Owen Hart, and Owen Hart gave him an enziguri kick to the back of the head. Shawn, though, was in control. He was posing in the ring in the middle of this match, and all of a sudden he started grabbing his head, and he collapsed in the middle of the ring, and he was motionless. And Earl Hebner is kind of looking at him, and he's kind of kicking him and seeing, is he okay? And then he realizes something is wrong, and he doesn't know what to do. He looks over at the announcers, and then he looks over at Owen Hart, who's outside conferring with Jim Cornette, and he says, you better stay there. And he makes a beeline to the back to bring other officials out. Vince McMahon, who was on commentary, puts the headset down, and he walks into the ring, and they go to commercial. They come back. They have an oxygen mask on him. They treated this like this was real stuff. They wanted people to believe that Shawn Michaels had really just collapsed, that he might have died here on this live television show. While all of this was going on and they were shooting this major angle, over on Nitro, they were airing the first ever singles meeting between Hulk Hogan and Sting. And I vividly remember flipping between the two channels. I wanted to know what was going on with Shawn Michaels, but I also wanted to see the Hogan-Sting match. And so back and forth I had to go. This was the struggle. You don't realize this. All these newer fans here with their DVR and their cloud-based this. You take your clouds and stick them up your ass. Back then, we only had VCRs. So if you had a VHS tape in another room, then yeah, you can tape one show and then in the other room you can watch the other show. But if you didn't have a VCR in a different room, if you didn't have a tape, all you could do was flip. There was no DVR. You couldn't hop on the computer after and bring it up on YouTube or some other site. Couldn't do it. So all you could do was flip. The Hogan thing was very weird. This was months before he joined the NWO. This was almost like a test run, I feel like. This was a way to test the waters, in my opinion, for an eventual Hulk Hogan heel turn. He looked like Hollywood Hogan. He was dressed in all black. He had no mustache, which was even more bizarre because it had been shaved off, I think, by... it might have been Arn Anderson. It was either the Dungeon of Doom or Arn Anderson, but he had his mustache shaved off on television previously in an angle. But he was dressed in all black. And you had Mongo McMichael on commentary saying, hey, you're getting Sting versus Hogan for free on TV when you should be getting it on pay-per-view. Yeah, no shit. No shit. 24 years ago this week, on November 17th, 1996, the first ever Survivor Series from Madison Square Garden. No Mr. Perfect, who had aligned with Hunter Hearst Helmsley a few weeks earlier on TV. He had just started up as his manager. Hennig was very upset with Vince McMahon for causing problems with his Lloyds of London policy. I think it had to do with, I don't know if actually Vince called Lloyd's of London behind his back and said, hey, he's going to wrestle, and then they canceled the policy, or I don't exactly know the logistics of what went down. And unfortunately, we can't ask Mr. Perfect, but he was upset with Vince, something regarding the Lloyd's of London stuff that he had fucked with. And I think McMahon had agreed, look, we'll pay you whatever it was that you would have been paid on that. I think they offered him a new deal. We'll make up the money for it. But Eric Bischoff swooped in and made him a better financial offer. And so he took the offer instead to go to WCW, and there was no Mr. Perfect at Survivor Series. There was no Curt Hennig in WCW either for many, many more months. I don't think he made his debut until the following summer, because the legal squabbling between WWE and WCW. This was the show where Rocky Maivia came out with that ridiculous haircut, making his debut. I think he went on to do some things in the company. I'm not sure. He was all right. He turned out to be okay. It would be Yokozuna's final ever WWE appearance. He was just gigantic. Absolutely gigantic by this point. How he was even mobile, I have no idea. And the company took him off the road after this with the hope that he would get his weight in check. He was every bit of 600 plus pounds at this point. A lot of commissions in the country wouldn't even license him to perform. So there wasn't a whole lot you could really do with him at that point. And it's a real shame because at 500 pounds when he first debuted, that's what they announced him at. When he first debuted, he was 505 pounds. Now, I don't know if he was 505. I don't know if they exaggerated it. And he was 460. He was a big guy, but not nearly as big as he would become later on. And he was very fleet of foot. He was very agile for a guy of that size. He could move around that ring. He was very impressive for a guy that size. But imagine if he had dropped down to 400 or 450 or whatever he was when he first debuted in 92 on WWE television. Imagine if he had dropped the weight and gotten back down to that. Still big enough to be a big man, still big enough to do the bonsai, but I can't imagine how much more impressive he would have been at that weight in the ring. More importantly, he probably would have lived a lot longer, because it wasn't very many years after that that he passed away. I mean, it was a few years later, but he died very young. He died, I think he was 34 when he died. Far too soon. Bret Hart had signed a 20-year deal to return to WWE and wrestled Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is their first big pay-per-view match together. Excellent match. And Psycho Sid won his first WWE Championship in the best match of his career, the best match of his life, against Shawn Michaels, who was booed vociferously by fans in the Garden that night. At least the male fans. All the girl fans were still cheering. Oh, Shawn! They were still cheering for him. They were wearing their Shawn Michaels glasses and the little beret and the fucking earrings coming out of their ears. But all the guys, they just booed the hell out of this guy. And this match was originally supposed to be Vader against Shawn Michaels in a rematch from SummerSlam. Vader was supposed to get the win and win the WWE title. And I assume it would have been Vader then going on to the Alamo Dome 2 months later and dropping it right back to Shawn. But this was a spot, and Jim Cornette has said the same thing. He was managing Vader at the time. This was a spot for Vader. Shawn Michaels did not like Vader. He did not like working with Vader. He pitched a hissy fit. And he got it changed, so he did not have to work with Vader anymore after the summer. Shawn, he did not take the loss very well. He did not take the reaction from the Garden Faithful very well. And he wrote in his book that he dealt with it the way that he dealt with a lot of things back then. He went out after the show, and he got wasted. 23 years ago this week, on November 17th, 1997, Ravishing Rick Rude made history by becoming the first and only person to appear on both Monday Night Raw and Monday Nitro on the very same night. And with a beard on one show and no beard on the other. Like magic. But it's even more impressive than that, because he also appeared on ECW Hardcore TV in some markets that very same night. It was the November 15th, 1997 episode of Hardcore TV. The ECW show aired on the weekends, but in some markets, it aired on Monday nights, late. Vince McMahon had proposed the idea of bringing back Rick Rude to the company, but he did not want to sign him to a contract. So imagine having that conversation. If you're Bruce Pritchard or Pat Patterson or whoever else, I want to bring back Rick Rude. Here's my idea. I want to bring him back, but I don't want to sign him to a contract. Okay. So what they ended up doing was they were just paying him per appearance. They were signing him to a bunch of per appearance deals, which Vince was warned against, but that's what he wanted to do. And so they brought him in as a bodyguard for DX, and it would come back to bite Vince on the ass. After the Montreal Screwjob, Rick Rude was very good friends with Bret Hart, and he was furious about what they did to him at the Survivor Series. Eric Bischoff got wind of this. He reached out to Rude and said, hey, let's make a deal. Which he could do because, again, he was not signed to a contract. So this was not contract tampering. This was not breach of contract. There was no contract to breach. WWE at the time was not airing live every week. I think at that point, it was 1 week live, 1 week taped, 1 week live, 1 week taped. I think that was the schedule at that point in 97. Their show that night had already been taped 6 days before. Bischoff found out that the DX segment with Rick Rude that was scheduled for Raw that night was not going to air until later in the show, and so he decided to trot out Rick Rude live on Nitro in the opening segment. He was going to set the tone early for that night, and there he was with his mustache and no beard, talking about how Shawn Michaels wasn't the real champion. He called WWE a sinking ship. Bruce Pritchard said that he and Vince McMahon, while all of this was happening, they were sitting together in the studios in Stamford, producing the live commentary for the show that night. When they saw Rude on a monitor, they saw him walk out on Nitro, and Pritchard said that the only word out of Vince McMahon's mouth at that moment was motherfucker. So, salute to the Ravishing one, the only man to ever appear on WWE, WCW, and ECW television, all in the same night. And nobody will ever be able to do that ever again. 19 years ago, on November 18th, 2001, marked the end of the Alliance and the end of the invasion at Survivor Series. I love how the promotional poster for this epic winner-take-all, us-against-them show featured just two people. Just two people. And those two people featured on the poster, Lita and Tori Wilson. Now, I get why they would want Lita and Tori Wilson on a poster, but considering the show and the stakes that were on the line, I just find it funny that they were the only two people on this pay-per-view poster. That's all you needed, I guess, back then to sell the show. That's all you needed. WWE left more money on the table with that invasion storyline than any other in the history of the company. This should not have been the end. With the right people, just with even some of the big names, even if they couldn't get them all at once, just with some of the big names that they didn't sign, who eventually did end up coming. They all ended up coming to WWE. I'm not counting Luger in this or Jarrett or any, but like Flair, Hogan, Hall, Nash, Steiner, Goldberg, they all ended up coming in anyway. They could have kept this thing going through WrestleMania and built to a real big dream supercard. But we still got Rock against Hogan, which is one of the best matches in WrestleMania history. So that's a nice consolation prize. The Dudleys beat the Hardys to unify the WWE and WCW tag team titles. Edge beat Test to unify the Intercontinental and the US titles. Test then went on to win an Immunity Battle Royal. giving him immunity from being fired by whoever controlled the company after the main event was over. 3 years later, he was fired. I guess that immunity did not extend beyond kayfabe. I guess it was only storyline immunity. He did not have immunity from actually being fired from his job. And in the main event, Team WWF, captained by The Rock, defeated the Alliance, captained by Stone Cold Steve Austin, for control of the company. And here's another great example of why this invasion failed. Of the 5 members of Team WCW ECW, 3 of the 5 were comprised of WWE stars. Stone Cold, Kurt Angle, and Shane McMahon. Those are your invaders. The only 2 invaders, real invaders, were Booker T and Rob Van Dam. Yet another reason why this thing was a failure. Kurt Angle, who had joined the Alliance a month earlier, was revealed to be a mole on the inside for Vince McMahon. He turned on Austin. That allowed Rock to hit him with a rock bottom and get the pin. The first Survivor Series in 1993. I'm sorry, the first one since 93, I should say, to end in a traditional elimination match was this one. This was 2001. There had not been a Survivor Series since 93 that actually concluded with an actual Survivor Series match, which is kind of crazy. And if you can believe it, it was the first time that The Rock had ever pinned Stone Cold in a match. Ever. Television, pay-per-view, live events, anywhere. First pinfall. Rock pinned Stone Cold, Survivor Series 2001. Now, the very next night on Raw brought us the debut of the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club. A club with many members long before this, I'm sure. But this was the first time we literally got to see somebody pucker up and kiss Vince McMahon's rear end on TV. And that honor went to William Regal. Jerry the King Lawler made his return to the announce booth for the first time since February of that year, when he walked out in protest of them firing his wife, Stacey Carter, the cat, Miss Kitty. No big deal. Lawler only missed probably the greatest WrestleMania of all time. We got Jim Ross and Paul Heyman on commentary for that one. But yes, he was replaced by Paul Heyman, who, after seeing the writing on the wall and realizing that ECW was dead, he made the jump to WWE. Didn't tell anybody. Didn't tell a soul. So imagine the surprise of the ECW roster. And why that is relevant is because you had people, a lot of the loyal diehards who had been with Paul, really since day one, who were still holding out hope and honestly believed that ECW, even though they hadn't run a show in 2 or 3 months, they believed that ECW was going to run another show. They believed ECW was going to live, that it was going to survive. Many of them were still owed money by Paul Heyman. Many of them, I believe, to this very day are still owed money by Paul Heyman. That they were still hopeful that ECW was going to run more shows. And then imagine what they must have been thinking when they see Paul Heyman's face pop up on WWE television. But on this night, they fired Heyman from the announce booth. They had him dragged, kicking and screaming from the ring, making way for Lawler to return. And Ric Flair made his first appearance on WWE television since 1993, announcing that he and Vince McMahon were now business partners. And Stone Cold Steve Austin was back to being a babyface again after a heel run that, business-wise, was a complete and utter failure. Creatively, there were aspects of it that I enjoyed. I love the comedy stuff with him and Vince and Kurt Angle. He only did that because he was hurt. Couldn't wrestle. He got hurt at the King of the Ring. And so what are you going to do with Stone Cold? Well, let's do some comedy. And we'll have him playing a banjo, and we'll have him buying cowboy hats for Kurt Angle. And yeah, it was goofy, but it worked. The chemistry between them was fantastic. But he only did that because he was injured. The moment that Austin shook hands with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 17, that marked the death of the Attitude Era. 18 years ago, on November 17th, 2002, Survivor Series returned to Madison Square Garden. For the second time, this was the debut of the Elimination Chamber. Triple H is said to have lobbied hard for a War Games match. Vince McMahon was cold to the idea, but he did like the idea of coming up with their own version of one. It should have just been War Games. I mean, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Keep it simple sometimes. Some match concepts are just too good to not be used. And they kept they kept that War Games match on the shelf for another 15 years before Triple H finally got his War Games match in NXT. Although I'm sure deep down inside, he would have loved to have been part of one. He could be. I mean, one of these years, if Triple H actually wants to wrestle a match in NXT, nothing is stopping him. It's his brand. He can do what he wants. But he did finally get to bring it back. This was not such a good night, though, for Triple H. First, Rob Van Dam crushed his larynx on a 5-star frog splash from the top of one of the corner pods. He underestimated the fact that he wouldn't have enough room to really stand upright, and so he kind of jumped awkwardly, and he crushed Triple H's throat. So it was more like a 3.25-star frog splash. And then to top it all off, he lost his World Heavyweight title to Shawn Michaels, which made for this great MSG moment. But it would be the final world title that Michaels would ever hold. In fact, it was the last singles title of any kind that Shawn Michaels would hold. And also on that show, Brock Lesnar suffered his first loss, losing the WWE title to the Big Show in a short match. Brock was hurt coming into the match, so they had to keep it short. I will never forget the moment that Lesnar got Big Show up on his shoulders for that F5. It is just one of those highlight reel moments that should have been in every WWE signature for the rest of time. And then John Cena came along and did the same thing to Big Show in every match they ever had. But it's still very impressive, though, to go back and watch what Lesnar, how he was throwing Big Show around, especially if he was hurt, which I didn't realize at the time that he was injured coming into the match. I think his ribs were all busted up, and this guy's 500 pounds. Big Show was big back then, or 450, whatever he was, and he's throwing this guy around, belly-to-belly suplex, and picking him up for an F5. That will never not be impressive to me. Paul Heyman turned on his client, and he aligned with Big Show to help him win the title, and Heyman should never, ever do that again. When Brock eventually comes back, and you know he will, he and Heyman should be kept together. You cannot split them up. You can tease it, but you cannot split them up. Never again. Now, the original idea for Survivor Series was to bring back Hulk Hogan for a rematch with Brock. Hogan put Lesnar over in a bear hug on TV the week before SummerSlam. And I believe it was Vince McMahon's idea that Brock would beat Hogan again. They would do it in the Garden. They would do it at Survivor Series, and Brock would win as a way to kind of really cement him once and for all. But Hogan had no interest in being jobbed out twice. I think Hogan figured, yeah, I'm down for the match, but I gotta win, brother. That don't work for me, brother. Hogan didn't like the idea of losing twice to Brock Lesnar, and so that plan went out the window, and Hogan, he eventually came back, but he didn't come back for many more months. And, Hogan actually, think about this. I understand Hogan, he is a very big name, and he thinks very highly of himself, and look, rightfully so. But imagine, Hogan actually thought that he would beat Brock Lesnar, the young, up-and-coming monster champion. I mean, maybe the Madison Square Garden crowd would have gone for it that night. I honestly don't think they would have. Maybe they would have. Maybe they would have popped. Maybe they would have wanted to see Hogan beat Lesnar. But that would have been a terrible decision. 10 years ago, on November 22nd, 2010, The Miz cashed in his Money in the Bank on Raw, beating Randy Orton to become WWE Champion after Orton had just wrestled Wade Barrett in a rematch from Survivor Series the night before. Will history repeat itself tonight at Survivor Series, 10 years later? It'll be a shame if it does, and Angry Miz Girl is not there to recreate the moment. But they have no fans in the Thunderdome, right? So I guess it doesn't matter anyway. 9 years ago, I told you this was a big week. This was a gigantic week. We only got 2 left, though. 9 years ago this week, on November 20th, 2011, I had the pleasure of attending my very first Survivor Series live from Madison Square Garden, which featured CM Punk beating Alberto Del Rio to kick off his 434-day reign as WWE champion, and the return of The Rock, his in-ring return for the first time since WrestleMania 20 in that very same building, tagging with John Cena against The Miz and R-Truth, who split up on Raw the next night. And the day after that, R-Truth was suspended for violating the wellness policy. And just like that, the awesome truth was no more. The Miz headlined WrestleMania and Survivor Series in the same year. And both times it was, if you really think about it, both times it was only to further the program between John Cena and The Rock. That is the only reason. That's the only, The Miz was like an afterthought. He was in the WrestleMania main event, but he was a complete afterthought because all people were waiting for was for The Rock to get involved, which he eventually did. In fact, Rock left Miz laying when the match was over. And then at Survivor Series, Rock and Cena just needed 2 bodies to beat. So, The Miz can always claim, man, I headlined WrestleMania that year, I headlined Survivor Series in the Garden against The Rock, but just everything, context is important here. It's not as if they really thought that highly of The Miz, other than just we needed, The Miz is the perfect person to put in this situation, but really it's about Cena and The Rock. It's not about The Miz. But the other thing I will never forget about that night is how over Zack Ryder was. And Zack Ryder was not even scheduled for the show. That was a big mistake that they made. They had Dolph Ziggler against John Morrison. Morrison was leaving. That was his last match. And they had Morrison against Ziggler for the U.S. title. And after the match, they had Ryder do a run-in. He got a big pop. And he did beat Dolph for the belt the following month at, I guess that would have been TLC. But they should have pulled the trigger that night. There should have been a United States Championship match in the Garden that night, in his backyard. Zack Ryder goes over, wins the title from Dolph. It would have been a huge moment. When the show was over and The Rock was cutting a promo for the live audience, he was drowned out by chants of Zack Ryder. I can't even fathom that happening here in 2020. But in 2011, Ryder got himself over with that Z True Long Island Story YouTube show, and he was over like Rover. And The Rock is back for the first time in 8 years, and he can't even hear himself speak because people are chanting Zack Ryder's name. He had to stop the promo and put Ryder over just to make sure that the fans kind of cooperated and didn't turn on him. That's how over Zack Ryder was at that time. Big mistake, not doing the match that night. And finally, 8 years ago this week on November 18th, 2012, The Shield made its debut at Survivor Series, interfering in a triple threat main event for the title between John Cena, CM Punk, and Ryback, helping Punk retain his title. Now, as Punk tells the story, after he turned heel that summer, WWE wanted to give him his own heel stable. And they wanted the Big Show to be his heater, which is just a fancy way of saying the Big Show basically would be his bodyguard, his heavy. Punk hated the idea. He loves Big Show. He's always said, I love the Big Show, but I hated that idea. So then they suggested, well, we'll put Daniel Bryan with you. And Punk didn't like that either. He felt that it would be better for them to wrestle each other again at some point. And it could be like this generation's Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. That's how he kind of described it. Punk takes credit instead for the idea that he pitched of having 3 guys brought up from FCW. Let's bring up 3 new guys who have not been on TV before, who people have not been exposed to. We can get over some new stars, and they can work with me, and I can work with them. And the guys that he wanted for this idea were Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Cassius Ohno. Right? Chris Hero. He wanted him to be the 3rd guy. WWE, they were fine with Rollins. They were fine with Ambrose. But they wanted Roman Reigns with them. And Punk was basically, his mindset was, look, I'm not going to die on this hill. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. If they want Roman Reigns, let them have Roman Reigns. Fine. And that was the idea that they went with. And honestly, it was the right call. It really was. Taking nothing away from the ability of Chris Hero, but it was the right call to make. Roman was the muscle of the group. He was the enforcer of the Shield. Each guy in that group looked completely different. And just looking at Roman and looking at Ono, of course they would have picked Roman because the dude looked like a star. Even back then he looked like a star. But it almost didn't even matter because they wanted to debut them with giant plastic riot shields with the word Shield written on them. And they wanted to put billy clubs in their hands. So yeah, imagine them trying to run into the ring with the billy clubs and the shields. It wouldn't have worked. It almost died in one night. Thankfully, they were talked out of that idea. I don't know whose idea that was, but they were talked out of it. And the Shield went on to become one of the greatest factions in company history. The Shield and Daniel Bryan carried those shows in 2013. Not taking anything away from Punk. Although Punk did miss part of 2013 after WrestleMania. But without those guys, without the Shield and without Daniel Bryan, as over as he was becoming, Monday Night Raw would have been far worse. They carried the show that year. And it's funny to hear The Undertaker and Kane on their Brothers of Destruction documentary on the network, talking about the streak ending at WrestleMania 30 and how Brock Lesnar didn't really need it. And if anybody was going to break the streak, they both said they would have preferred that it be Roman Reigns. Roman had more to gain from it, they said. Even though I thought the streak never should have been broken, I think that was a big mistake. Now, they made the most of it, right? Brock went on this incredible tear. I think he did so at the expense of basically making everybody on the roster look weak. But it did kind of set him on his path to squashing John Cena and becoming this unbeatable, unstoppable champion. So the best I could say about it is it made for a shocking moment that nobody will ever forget. And they did not drop the ball on Brock Lesnar. Right? They put Brock over strong and they saw it through to the end. They didn't bungle that part of it. So I will give them that. I still don't believe the streak ever should have been broken. That being said, if they were going to do it, the idea that I had pitched years ago on the Sound Off, and I'd be curious to get your feedback. I know some people are not going to like this because they're going to think, oh, it cheapens it because there's more than one person involved. But just hear me out on this. The idea that I had pitched was for Roman Reigns to be the one to break the streak, but do so while he was still a member of the Shield. Really, all 3 members of the Shield would get the win over The Undertaker, rather, at WrestleMania. That was the idea. It would be a gauntlet match. I don't remember if I pitched Undertaker wrestling Rollins first and then Ambrose, or Ambrose and then Rollins, but it doesn't matter. Undertaker would win the first match. He would win the second one, but it would be harder. He would be more, tired and kind of beaten down. But he would manage to pull it out. And it doesn't bury, Ambrose because he lost to a guy who just wrestled him. It doesn't bury him because it's WrestleMania. People just assume The Undertaker's going to win. He's unbeatable. He's like Michael Myers at WrestleMania. No matter what you do to the guy, you can't put him down. So he gets through the first 2 members of the Shield. But then he would lose ultimately in the third fall or the third match to Roman Reigns. Roman Reigns would be the one to finally put him down. So the Shield could take credit for ending the streak, and that could be their big thing for months. These are the guys that broke the streak. They've taken this company by storm. They did what nobody else could do. They did the impossible. They can go around and gloat about this for the rest of their lives. But specifically, Roman Reigns would be the one gloating and almost hogging all the glory and taking credit for being the man who actually pinned The Undertaker and beat him, even though Rollins and Ambrose, they softened him up. They kind of served him up to Roman, but Roman is the one who kind of goes off and is taking credit for it. And that is the seed right there that eventually contributes to the breakup of the Shield, because they're tired of Roman getting all the glory and he's the one gloating about it. And what about us? And they become kind of jealous of him. And you could have built eventually, not right away, but eventually you could have built to the Shield split just based on that, if you wanted to. I mean, remember, the Shield put Undertaker through a table on SmackDown. They gave him the triple powerbomb through a table on SmackDown. This was the year before the streak even got broken. And I think he actually legitimately got hurt on that spot, but Undertaker went away. We didn't see him again. So it would not have been a stretch for the Undertaker coming back to say, hey, Undertaker is back now to, looking for revenge against the three punks who put him on the shelf and agreed to just wrestle all three of them in a gauntlet, one right after the other in whatever order at WrestleMania, and put his streak on the line.